What's the hardest thing about writing? Well, it's getting started. Maybe you're having a hard time coming up with a story idea, or you're stuck on where to take your story next. If you want a way into a story or a way through, I have 9 story starters to help you. This free PDF is full of story seeds and prompts to get you going. To download your 9 story starters, go to nancypanuccio.com/start. That's Nancy with an I, Panuccio with 2 C's, nancypanuccio.com/start. Backstory gets tedious, especially when it's doled out in big chunks of narrative. It has a way of taking over the story, and it's often just static telling that doesn't engage the reader. It's just information the writer thinks the reader needs. Writer Unleashed is for you, a writer who has a story you want to bring onto the page and into the hearts and minds of readers. I'm Nancy Panuccio, writer, editor, and writing coach. And each week, we'll explore techniques, mindsets, and inspiration for writing stories readers can't put down. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Now let's begin. Often when I'm coaching writers or whenever I'm reviewing a manuscript, I'll highlight big chunks of backstory that's getting in the way of the story. It's often unnecessary or it's in the wrong place. It throws readers out of the story. And I see this in every manuscript that makes its way across my desk. Writers miscalculate how much backstory they need, and it's not distributed in a way that keeps readers interested, and sometimes its placement is just off. More often than not, the backstory is not essential to the now story. So, in today's episode, we'll explore common reasons writers overwrite backstory, and I'll give you 3 ways to think about backstory so that it doesn't overwhelm your front story, but complements and deepens it. Before we get to that, what is backstory? Backstory is any narrative that happened in the story's past. It fills in these perceived gaps. Most often, where writers go wrong is using backstory to justify the character's behavior in the present or to explain their current situation and the events that led up to it. So it fills in perceived gaps in the story that the writer believes is necessary in order for the reader to understand what's happening in the present of the story. And there are 3 common ways writers go wrong with backstory. Number 1, they dump a lot of extraneous information that halts the story's pace and momentum. Number 2, it tells at the expense of showing. And number 3, it often gives too much away too soon, answering too many questions and leaving nothing for the reader to wonder about. For example, let's say the story begins in the aftermath of some significant event. The writer will often reach back into that traumatic past with a line or 2 here and there, rather than allow the past to bear pressure on the now story. It gives too much information and deflates our urge to know what happened that brought the character to their present situation. So the backstory is giving away too much too soon. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a little backstory, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it's far better to allow the story's past to build if, and only if, it's essential to the story unfolding in the present. If something traumatic happened before we meet the protagonist on page 1, a novice writer might spend too much time in narrative space in that backstory, rather than let it bear pressure on the story's present and allow that traumatic event to unfold in deepening disclosure as the story presses forward. Now, sometimes a tragic event doesn't need a lot of backstory at all. The tragedy is implied as a past event that's still impacting the characters in the present. I'm thinking of Bobby Ann Mason's story, Shiloh, where we meet the characters, Leroy and Norma Jean, in an already disintegrating marriage. On page 2, we learn of their baby's sudden death 10 years before. We don't learn about the baby's death straight away. I think the baby's death is only mentioned once, and it was very brief. Yet what we begin to understand without being told is that this was the beginning of the demise of this marriage. It's hinted at, but just as the characters are not confronting their grief head on, just as they're suppressing it, we don't get the whole backstory surrounding his death because the characters are too afraid to confront that part of their past. I'm also thinking of the story Garden City by Francis Wong. The main characters are struggling years later in the aftermath of their son's death, but were never chased into a corner with that child's death. We don't learn about it right away. And that's because the characters are rooted in their current story problem, which is to rent the empty apartment they invested in years ago, which no one seems to want to live in. But they don't overwhelm the front story with the past, especially their son's death. It's mentioned briefly by Mrs. Chen at the bottom of page 2. And later by Mr. Chen in a single paragraph, who's grappling with guilt at not having spent enough time or attention on his son. So there's a lot of regret. Now, neither character dwells on it in long detours of backstory. But in both examples, the story is not about the child's death, and so we don't need copious backstory. Yes, it's imprinting their despair in the story's present, but it's not the main story problem. In Garden City, the main story problem is the empty apartment, but the empty apartment symbolizes their loss. In Shiloh, the main story problem is Leroy's quest to regain his wife's love and admiration. But in both cases, that backstory is not given a lot of narrative space. The other thing about backstory is that it's often summary that might be better served as an isolated flashback scene or cut out completely. Backstory gets tedious, especially when it's doled out in big chunks of narrative. It has a way of taking over the story, and it's often just static telling that doesn't engage the reader. It's just information the writer thinks the reader needs. Sometimes the characters will have conversations where they talk about the backstory. They're either rehashing what we already know from previous backstory, or they're telling us something about the past that would be better demonstrated in flashback, in scene. So here are 3 ways to think about backstory so you can use it more strategically and effectively. Number 1, significant history. Backstory is anything that happened before page 1. Now, in small doses and with the right placement, backstory is useful. It can give relevant background about a character so we understand them in the present. A line or 2, or a scene demonstrating a significant moment from the past. But a better and more useful way to think about backstory and what could help you decide what to include is significant history. If April is a bored, unhappy housewife in the story's present, and that presents a conflict between her and her husband, then it makes sense to give a few lines about her past aspirations as an actress to shine light on the present action, the present conflict. If Frank is conflicted about whether to stay in his boring job or quit and move to Paris, significant history embodying those mixed feelings and presented in a separate chapter could be the first day he went to work with his dad when he was 10. For example, in Revolutionary Road, 10-year-old Frank straddles wonder and pride at wearing his first suit, followed by disillusionment, boredom, and even disgust. It's significant because it gives us insight into his ongoing inner conflict in the story's present. It's his fatal flaw. Sometimes significant history gives us the necessary context for the problem the protagonist will be forced to grapple with as the story presses on. It's significant because it gives us insight into how the character entered the story wanting what he or she wants and the internal conflict the character is struggling with. Here's an example from Raymond Carver's story Cathedral. The story opens with the main story problem in the story's present. The blind man, an old friend of my wife's, he was on his way to spend the night. His wife had died, so he was visiting his dead wife's relatives in Connecticut. Arrangements were made. He would come by train, a 5-hour trip, and my wife would meet him at the station. She hadn't seen him since she worked for him one summer in Seattle 10 years ago, but she and the blind man had kept in touch. They made tapes and mailed them back and forth. I wasn't enthusiastic about his visit. He was no one I knew, and his being blind bothered me. My idea of blindness came from the movies. In the movies, the blind man moved slowly and never laughed. Sometimes they were led by seeing eye dogs. A blind man in my house was not something I looked forward to. Okay, so he establishes the story problem in the present, and then he goes into backstory for another 4 paragraphs that tells the story of his wife's relationship with the blind man, how she needed a job that summer. She had no money, and so she responded to an ad she saw in the paper, help wanted, reading to a blind man. So we learn a few key things about his wife's relationship with the blind man, and all of this is significant history because it supports and sheds insight into the narrator's discomfort. Now the same blind man was coming to sleep in my house. So, significant history. It's not just extraneous backstory. It's related to the central story problem. He's a little jealous of his wife's friendship with this man and deeply uncomfortable because he has no experience with blind people. I would be anxious in his situation too. Of course, all of this changes by the end of the story. He solves his story problem. So only include what's significant to the main story problem. Okay, on to number 2. Significant history is a now construct, not a past construct. If the past is still in the present, it's significant. If it's just backfill, you can probably cut most, if not all of it. So if the past is still in the present, it's significant. For example, if you run into your ex at a party, if you're truly over him, and if it's a pleasant encounter with no emotional residue for you, the past is truly in the past. But if you run into your ex at a party and it triggers resentment or hurt, the past is still in the present. So if the past is still in the present, it's significant. If it's just backfill, then you probably don't need it. In Cathedral, his wife's past is bearing pressure on the narrator's present. It's creating unease. If we didn't have that history, we wouldn't fully experience the dilemma. In Bobby Ann Mason's story, Shiloh, their child who died is still in the present, even though the characters never speak about it to one another. It's mentioned briefly on page 2. They had a child who died as an infant years ago. They never spoke about their memories of Randy, which have almost faded, but now that Leroy is home all the time, they sometimes feel awkward around each other, and Leroy wonders if one of them should mention the child. Yeah, I think that's the only time he mentions that particular backstory. But instead of hitting us with a lot of backstory about the child, the imagery supports it. What Leroy wants in the story is to build his wife a log house. She keeps telling him she doesn't want it, but he persists, thinking this might save his marriage. But their infant son's death, that backstory that happened 10 years ago, way before we meet these characters, is still in the present. And that's revealed through imagery, not pages and pages of backstory. For example, they go for a picnic in a park next to a cemetery. Small children in bright clothing are cavorting and squealing. Those are not superfluous details. The story is not about the sudden death of their son. It's about Leroy's attempt to repair the distance he feels growing in his marriage. What's implied is that they haven't ever spoken about their son or the pain of losing him. What's implied is that it's not just Leroy's accident that has led to their distance, it's the death of their son. And their inability to talk about it has played a big part in the erosion of their marriage. The story doesn't focus on that backstory. It stays rooted in the present. On to number 3. The past is no indication of the future, and it doesn't motivate us in the present. Often writers think that by writing excessive backstory, they're revealing and fleshing out their characters. But more often than not, backstory just waters the story down, and it creates relatively shallow characters. Characters are revealed more by their hopes for the future. They're motivated more by their hopes and projections into the future. With that hope comes fear, interference, and obstacles. Every love story is a hope for the future. We don't need pages and pages of backstory about the characters' lousy childhoods. Backstory conflates our relationship with time. The past doesn't really create your present or your future. The belief in the future affects the quality of your present. It creates anxiety, hope, fear. If you believe tomorrow will suck, you'll be scared about it today. We go to the gym because of the future outcome we want, not because of our past. Love is a future construct. It's a hope for the future, a belief in the future. It impacts our relationships. So activate your character's belief in the future. Leroy's hope for the future is that he'll build his wife a log cabin and he'll restore her love. Mr. and Mrs. Chen hope for the future is that they'll rent their empty apartment. It's the desired future that creates the story problem. Stay rooted in your character's current problem. Often writers overdo backstory to explain or justify character behavior in the story's present. They think they need to show the psychological origins of their character's actions. They think it explains character motives in the now story. But most of us aren't aware of how our psychology impacts the present. We act on impulse without thinking about our past, our childhood, or what happened yesterday. Sure, if we're in therapy, we think about those things and we might understand and analyze how our past influence our current problems and behaviors, but we're probably not mulling this over in the throes of our response to a particular charged situation. So the past isn't always the best way to explain character motive in the present of the story. We're far more motivated by our hopes for the future than what happened in our past, and we're usually rooted in a particular problem. We're not linking it to our past, so you don't need as much backstory as you think. You could know your character's backstory, and that's fine, but you don't need it all on the page. Instead, the past can bear pressure on the present. So focus more on what your character wants, what his or her hopes are for the future. Use backstory sparingly and only as it relates to your character's main story problem. Okay, so let's wrap this up. When you rely too much on backstory, you're missing the element of discovery. It's convenient. We tend to think linearly, and we see backstory as a bridge between the story's past and its present. So here are 3 ways to think about backstory. Number 1, think of it as significant history. That will help you be more selective. Number 2, significant history is a now construct. It's not a past construct. And number 3, characters are more motivated by their hopes for the future than what happened in their past. Everything does really live in the now. And here are some final thoughts to think about. Information about a person does not equate the life of a person. When you write too much backstory, the risk is that you're writing about the character rather than revealing him or her. Backstory is often overused because of some common misconceptions about what the reader needs in order to understand what's happening in the present. But the reader can infer and fill in what's not said. And this is what makes the story exciting. The reader gets to participate. Not all information is written, it's felt. The gap tells the reader a lot. It allows us to participate and keeps us more invested in your character's outcome. So there you have it. Thanks for hanging out with me today. And if you know any writers who need some support in their writing, please share this episode or the Writer Unleashed podcast in general. And if you love what you're listening to, subscribe on your favorite listening platform and please leave me a review. Reading how this podcast impacts your writing truly lights me up and helps me create topics for the show. Till next time, keep writing, and I'll talk to you soon.